Today on Northern Revolutions, we're continuing my discussion with Bob Egan from Wilco and Blue Rodeo. So stay tuned. Hey everybody, welcome to Northern Revolutions. I'm Rob. Welcome back if you're returning. Welcome if you're new. Thank you for coming back. This is part two of the discussion that I had with Bob Egan, my friend and musician that was part of Wilco and Blue Rodeo for a number of years. If you haven't seen part one, I'll leave the link in the description. Please check it out. Bob talks about a lot of the records that shaped him as a musician, and that he is passionate about. This is a continuation of the discussion that he and I had, and I hope you'll enjoy it.
So, transition from David Lindley, the hero for me of lap steel guitar, to my third hero in the holy trinity of slide and lap steel, Lowell George from the band Little Feat. Now, are you familiar with Little Feat?
I know them, and I know a few songs, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, probably their biggest hit is a song called Willin', where the chorus is, if you give me weed, whites, and wine, show me a sign, I'll be willing to be moving. It's about truck drivers, a song about driving a truck. But Lowell George was so influential in the slide guitar world because he was the guy that took the Stratocaster and compressed the hell out of it for the unmistakable sound. And for a slide, he used a Sears Craftsman socket.
Okay.
Yeah, so a big stainless steel, heavy thing, almost like a steel guitar weight, but on his finger on a Stratocaster.
No kidding.
And these days, it's the tone. He taught and mentored and was very good friends with Bonnie Raitt.
Yes.
So if you listen to Bonnie Raitt's slide playing, you're essentially hearing the tone that the Lowell George developed.
Okay.
Of compressing the hell out of a Stratocaster. And Lowell George was, Little Feat were so groundbreaking in so many ways. They had an amazing drummer, but also Sam Clayton on percussion. So they had grooves to beat the band all day long. And they also had their other secret weapon, their piano player, Billy Payne, from New Orleans. So he brought in the whole stride, New Orleans, boogie woogie funk, Dr. John Allen Toussaint type of thing to this. And Billy Payne went on to, he did a lot of side work. So he played on Bonnie Raitt's records. Actually, when I saw Jackson Browne, during the same time as I saw Springsteen on the River Tour, Jackson was so impressed with Bruce that he started to do a rock show too. So he would play for 4 hours. And he had both David Lindley and he had Billy Payne from Little Feat on keyboard. So it all kind of came together.
Right.
But their songwriting, their instrumentation, the groove that they got on these types of records, it was a big part of my development as a slide guitar player, but also just the sheer musical enjoyment of this. Now, as a side note, they put out, I think, one of the other great live records in the canon, called Waiting for Columbus, a double live record,
Mm-hmm.
where they also brought in a horn section. They brought in the Tower of Power horn section.
Yep.
Now, they did Tower of Power, one of the best horn sections in the world. They did not play like Alan Toussaint's musicians interwoven in the band, but their arrangements are such that they lift these songs to a whole nother level. It's a beautiful blend of this funky percussion and New Orleans piano, amazing slide guitar with the Tower of Power horn section, and great songs.
Nice.
Big fan of Little Feat.
I
So,
recognize that one.
Yep. If we go from LA, which all these last few bands have been situated in, up the coast, of course, we get to San Francisco, and what I think one of the holy grails of live records of all time, Europe 72 by the Grateful Dead. All right? Just 3 discs of amazing playing.
There's a guy that I do a weekly live stream with. He's a huge Grateful Dead fan, so he'll appreciate that.
Well, there are deadheads out there, yes.
Yeah.
There are many.
I wouldn't
of us
say
out
he's the stereotypical deadhead, but he's got a big picture of Jerry Garcia on the wall behind him.
Yeah, that's pretty into it.
Yep.
They, the Dead were not big in Europe, but they went over and they were able to play these small theaters, and they brought with them a couple big 2-inch recording machines, right? And they had grand pianos at every stop. Keith Godchaux, this was one of his first records when he came in to Pigpen is still on here. And just beautiful playing, beautiful songs, beautiful jams, and how they make this whole thing flow. Certainly a soundtrack of my high school years. So this was done in 1972. 2 years later, in 74 was the first time I saw the Grateful Dead. I got my buddies, Chip and Roach, we were seniors in high school, got into my Volkswagen Bug Beetle, drove to Des Moines, Iowa from central Illinois, so about 6 hours. And they played a legendary show, which you can find in all the archives, at Des Moines, Iowa, 1974, where they played outside with their wall of sound. Are you familiar with the wall of sound?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So instead of having a big PA where they mic small guitar amplifiers, they said, well, instead of having, 2 12-inch speakers for my guitar being mic'd through the PA, we'll do without the PA, and I'll have 40 12-inch speakers in this assembly for every instrument. Just stunning. If you've never heard of it, it's worth a Google, the wall of sound.
Yep.
And the fact that the Grateful Dead were instrumental in the development of so much in audio, live sound, instruments, guitars, keyboards, and they were so instrumental in the DIY movement, in starting your own label, in building your own fan base. And I used to get postcards from the Grateful Dead. That's what they did pre-internet.
Wow. And
they would send me 45 records of upcoming releases. That's an incentive to buy the album.
Wow.
Incredible. I mean, they lost their shirt and all this stuff, but they tried. They went out and did all this marketing. So 17 years old, saw them in 1974. After the show, they played 6.5 hours.
6.5 hours?
Yep.
Holy shit.
Stunning show. It was Jerry Garcia without a beard, right? Clean shaven.
I'm not sure what that, I've never seen him without a beard.
I was 10 feet from the stage. I have photographs from that. And after the show, we're walking through the parking lot. There's a limo stuck in traffic. Go over. Garcia rolls down the front window. Weir and Kreutzmann and a woman were in the back. And we talked to him for about 10 minutes.
No kidding.
Yeah, shook Jerry's hand. And it's like, Bob Weir said, well, so what's the next show? Are you coming up in Minneapolis? And I go, what do you mean? He goes, well, you're not coming to another show? I said, dude, you just played for 6.5 hours. I was young. I didn't know the whole travel to see the Dead from multiple shows yet.
Yeah.
But as we left, as we bid our adieu to him, say goodbye, we're walking away, and my buddy Chip had a bag of peanuts, and he called back. He said, "Hey Jerry, do you want a peanut?" And Jerry said, words I've lived by ever since. He said, "No thanks, man. I just had a marshmallow."
That's fantastic. That's a great story.
Yeah, at 17, I got to meet the Dead. And then, of course, many decades later, I was at their last show in Soldiers Field in Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody knew it at the time, but that was Jerry's last show.
Right.
I was there as well.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy.
That's awesome.
Crazy. Sticking with the Dead theme, of course, like the brilliant Jerry Garcia's first solo record. And I have played the bejesus out of it. You can tell just from the warped and stained cover, but the vinyl is in good shape, right? Jerry went in the studio with Bill Kreutzmann, the drummer, and played all the instruments. Bill did all the drums, and came out with, I think, just a masterpiece of a record. The songs are crisp, and beautiful, and brilliant, wonderfully produced, and the musicianship is just fantastic. But one of the things that stands out is Jerry lets loose on pedal steel guitar on this record. And he lets loose in a way, his most known pedal steel playing is, of course, on Teach Your Children by Crosby, Stills, and Nash.
Yep.
Where he's kind of aping a country thing. But here, he's more atmospheric. He's more for the slow melodic thing where the steel plays a supporting role, like a choir or a string quartet, that type of thing. And it was a direct influence on the path I took on pedal steel.
I was going to say, as you're saying that, I've heard you say before, the role of a pedal steel player is to add color. And that's kind of, well, that's what I think of when I think of that. He adds color to it.
Yeah, in a just a beautiful way.
Yeah.
And yeah, it influenced the direction I went on steel, away from the country chicken picking, more towards the ethereal, atmospheric, adding color thing, and which is why I had the career I did.
Yeah.
Right? That was kind of sought after by the people I played with. So thanks, Jerry. Miss you. I'm known for my steel playing, but I played guitar my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And a huge guitar fan, right? And of course, when these records came out in the 70s and late 60s, and I was in grade school and high school, they were mind-blowing at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And nothing more mind-blowing than...
The king of them all.
Yeah, really the king of them all.
Yep.
Jimi Hendrix, right? And the songs on this record alone, he only put out, was it 2 studio records or 3 studio records?
I think it was 3.
Yeah.
3, maybe 4.
And then all of the live records and the recuts after
and
he
then a lot
died.
of posthumous releases. And stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So
Incredible.
Purple Haze, right? What a hit. You can imagine being a freshman in high school, and this song about acid comes out, right? And you're thinking, there's a big world out there. Purple Haze, Hey Joe, Foxy Lady, The Wind Cries Mary, Fire, that song Fire, right? This is Jimmy at his, I think, his finest.
I think so.
I
think so. I have that. I love it. I think I've got all his studio albums, I think.
Yeah, and the influence that he had on generations of guitarists, right?
When I was first learning to play, and as people who watch me know, I like to say I'm the world's most average, shitty guitar player. But I play for fun and I have fun. When I was first learning, the first guitar I bought was a Stratocaster. Actually, that burgundy one that's back in the corner.
Oh, yeah.
So first one I bought, and I bought it because when I heard a Hendrix play it, I was just blown away by the sound you could get out of a Stratocaster. Not that I had any illusions that I could ever make, but I just loved the sound of that instrument, and that's the reason my first guitar was a Stratocaster.
Well, nobody had made those sounds before, right?
Exactly.
And these they'd be considered vintage Stratocasters today, but they were just brand new Strats off the shelf,
right?
That he would play.
Yep.
There's nothing amped up or special about them. It's, turn the Marshall on 10, plug in the Strat, and a wah-wah, and that was it.
Yeah.
But where it all came from, were his hands, right? The tone, and how he was able to work these with such emotion. Groundbreaking. He really was the first, in my opinion. Well, there are many, incredible guitar heroes before him.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly Les Paul, right? Stunning players.
Yeah.
Chet Atkins, Wes Montgomery.
Mm-hmm.
Like the list goes on. Once you step outside of rock and roll, there's Jimmy Bryant, and Speedy West, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were in country and jazz, Django Reinhardt. There were guitar monsters, but he was the first in rock to be the electric guitar monster and take this instrument to a whole other dimension. And anybody who's followed in those footsteps as a guitar guy or gal owns their position to Hendrix.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wouldn't have happened without him.
Agreed.
Jimmy. And then, shortly after Hendrix was a guy who kind of brought a lot of amazing things together, right? Carlos Santana. Just look at this record and the raw sexuality and trippiness, right, that this thing conjures up. It conjures up an acid trip. It's just amazing. Abraxas by Santana.
That's an album that's pretty important to me.
Yeah.
One of the most important records I own. My dad, my hero, gave me that record as a teenager because I was getting into I started with the Beatles and I was listening to the Band and Creedence and Fleetwood Mac, and, fairly stable, safe, rock and roll that you hear on the radio. And then he gave me this and he goes, I want you to try something a little out of the ordinary. Listen to this album. Incredible. So I still own it. And I can't not see that album cover and think of him and think of the experience of listening to it with him.
Wow.
Aside from the music, just the album itself is hugely important to me.
That's
Great
fantastic. Record. Well, that's what vinyl is for people of a certain vintage, right?
Yes.
It brings back all of those memories.
Yeah.
The beauty of this record, one, is that, of course, he brought in all the Latin percussion, which opened the door to, really beats and hip hop and all of that.
It's true.
The rhythm was the foundation of this type of music, and it was exotic. Certainly for white kids at Woodstock and across America in the 60s and 70s, it was unbelievable. And then his playing, right? Just very vocal, right? So emotional. So he, and sweet, just stunning and instantly recognizable. He was on some hits, in the last decade. Where you'd be in a shop and you'd hear some pop singer, and then the guitar.
He did that one with Rob Thomas from Matchbox 20, which was like a top 20 radio hit or whatever.
And there was one with a female singer. And when it comes, the guitar hits it, you're like, oh yeah, well that's Carlos Santana.
Exactly.
Beautiful, beautiful music, and really opened the door for electric guitar for kids could do.
I also loved it being a big Fleetwood Mac fan, and not just the Rumors Fleetwood Mac. Like I like Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac. I like all Fleetwood Mac, and they do a great cover of Black Magic Woman, which is a great Peter Green song.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably the hit off that record that everyone would probably know.
Yes, they would recognize kind of and the is part of a suite, really. Leading in and out of it, right?
Yeah. Great record.
Carlos. And then speaking of guitar heroes, one of the most undersung guys that was just phenomenal. My first ever guitar hero, Johnny Winter.
Yeah.
Texas boy, brother of Edgar Winter.
I've seen Edgar before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have as well. Edgar, of course, had his big hits, Frankenstein
Yep.
and Free Ride.
Yep.
I guess that was late 70s, early 80s.
Yep.
That was huge. Johnny toiled with less fame than that, but truly a speed demon, hyper blues
Yep.
guitar player with a vocal growl that was just amazing. And on this record, part of his band is Rick Derringer.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yep. And Rick Derringer, of course, went on to have a hit with a song on this record, Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo,
Yep.
which was written by Rick, and then just included on this album. Yes, it was written by Rick. But this was recorded, now there's not a date on it, but a long time ago. This had to be like 1969 or 1970. And he just unleashed it, both slide guitar and regular guitar. Very fast player, very visceral guitar player. One of my first guitar heroes. I don't know how well it ages, but he certainly put it all out there. And I think one of the big legacies that he did leave was that he brought one of my all-time heroes. He brought Muddy Waters out of a semi-retirement to make a couple records.
Yep.
His first one called Hard Again, and you can see on the back, there's Johnny Winter right there with Muddy, and that would be, I think, James Cotton on harmonica. And what he did is he wanted to recreate the classic sounds of when these guys first recorded. So they think they found a studio in Chicago. It might have been the old Room Chess, and they all got in a room and recorded live the classic songs that Muddy made famous in the 50s and early 60s. And they did this in the 70s or 80s, I think, probably the 80s. I think it's one of the last things that Muddy did. But his love of his heroes, bringing them back and documenting the greatness of Muddy Waters. And these do not sound like remakes. They sound like the original raw tracks.
Nice.
Right? And I think he's also has Pinetop Perkins on this one. He was a piano player back in the day. Yep, Pinetop Perkins in piano. So when I lived in Chicago in the early 80s, this was in 77, there was Pinetop Perkins played on the north side, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 blocks from my house on Wednesday nights.
Really?
In a bar.
Nice.
And there would be 5, 10 people. In this bar that would seat 200 people. And I would go every Wednesday night.
Wow.
And to sit there and just soak in Pinetop Perkins, the original piano player on all these.
Yeah.
For Willie Dixon and
Right.
Muddy Waters back in the day in the 50s and 60s.
Wow.
I just soaked that in as much as possible because that was the thing.
Yeah, I would have too.
Yeah. I didn't necessarily want to sit by myself Wednesday night in a bar with nobody else.
Right.
But for Pinetop Perkins,
Of
I
course.
felt, you kind of have to.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And I talked to him a number of times. He was such a gracious man.
Nice.
Yeah. That's the magic that used to happen in those live music clubs back then. Yeah. I mean, Al Green, like the guy.
The guy.
The voice, the life, right? Like, excuse me, this guy's story is just stunning.
Isn't it though?
Yeah. So all of his records have got spots of magic,
Mm-hmm.
and probably the one I would play most would be like his greatest hits. But on this one, he's got Take Me to the River,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which was made perhaps even more famous by Talking Heads.
Yep.
Who did a great version of
Yep.
it. But to go back to this guy's voice and what he could do, and the Memphis production, right? The guys that played on this, Willie Mitchell, of course, producer and drummer, right? Just the Hodges, Teeny Hodges on guitar, and his brothers on bass and piano. Just amazing stuff. And of course, the Memphis Horns, what would become the Memphis Horns, right? With Wayne Jackson doing the horns on these records. He just an amazing, transcendental, almost by the guy's voice, right? It takes you to another world.
It really does.
And for, a farm boy from the white farm boy from the Midwest, it was one of these things that broke down the racial barrier. Of course, Sly and the Family Stone was a real big act for that.
Yep.
And then, of course, once you open the blues and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, Albert King, B.B. King, right? It just, it didn't stop. I lived down in south of Memphis, as I was speaking earlier, in Oxford, Mississippi. And one of the things I was hip to there by the locals is, well, you got to go to Al Green's church. So, after Al Green almost died, he converted to be a very strong Christian and founded his own church and ministered there every Sunday.
Really?
Yeah. So in the 90s, if he wasn't out on tour, you could go up and see him in his church. And it's a little neighborhood, small Baptist church, nothing fancy. And you walk in and there he is standing with a couple people greeting you as you come in the door. You don't even really recognize him.
That's crazy.
Right? In his robes.
Yeah.
And it was, in my top 3 or 4 concerts I've ever seen in my life, seeing Al Green in his church is one of them.
That would be,
yeah.
I can only imagine.
Yes, well, he had a full-on band with big double-stack PVPA, of course, being Mississippi.
Yeah.
Hammond organ, drummer, guitar, bass. And the service started by this a cappella gospel hymn as the choir shuffles in. So it's like 26 people, all in white robes, men and women, marching 2 by 2 down the aisle, singing, followed by one tall woman dressed in black. A very gorgeous, beautiful woman, followed by Al. And they walk by you and you hear Al's voice, distinctive. He's singing right along with everybody. And during this service, right, he would say, oh, we got a lot of visitors. Look at all the white people here. Welcome. He said, I know why you're here. He goes, and he start singing his hits, and he goes, yeah, I don't do that, right? And then he starts singing another hit, I don't do that, right? And then he would say, but you got to know that God gave his only son. The piano would find out what key, and then the band comes in just hitting it. The choir comes in, and it was just a throwdown rock and roll.
I have the vision that it's like that scene in the Blues Brothers.
It's exactly like that.
Yeah,
it's exactly like that.
That would be awesome.
And it wasn't for the camera; it was real.
Yeah.
And but it was the theater of it, right? So in this particular branch of Christianity, people are called on by the Holy Spirit, and they speak in tongues, which means they lose control and they fall back, and the congregants catch them. And as the Holy Spirit enters their body and speaks through them, this is their belief. Well, conveniently, at the figurative and literal climax of this 2-hour service, the one woman I was talking about earlier, the one in the black robes, not the whites, that was very attractive, started to speak in tongues and fell and was caught by the congregants, all choreographed to the ground. And Al, it's in the middle of a song and he's just singing down to her, straddles her, a foot on each side of her, just bending down, and she is convulsing. And it was this marriage, and choreographed this way, obviously, of passion and sex and spirituality, right?
Right.
And it was just drop dead perfect. I came out of there, couldn't feel from the feet down or the elbows down for stomping and clapping,
Right.
going out of my mind at this rock show.
That's awesome.
On how they were able to whip the crowd into this frenzy. Just true rock and roll.
Power of music.
Yeah, and they used it in the service of the Maker.
Yeah.
Right. Just such a moving thing.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, very, very lucky. I did that a few times.
Nice.
Which is a great segue into, I think, one of the great all-time musicians. You wouldn't know it from this cover. Hank Wilson's Back, Volume 1. Of course, that's the late, great Leon Russell, playing country music. So his name barely appears on here. He's going under the moniker Hank Wilson, and he put out a country record of all of the country classics, all of the greats of Hank Williams and George Jones. It's just stunning what he did here. So if you are a country music fan, this is an essential record to have. If you're thinking about maybe old country and you don't know where to start, what a great primer this would be. What he did is he went to Nashville and he recorded with all of the A players that played on the original hits.
Right.
He brought them all back into Bradley's barn, I think the studio where it all happened, and recorded this incredible, heartfelt homage to country music. And it stands up. It's not gimmicky, it's from the heart. Leon Russell, an Oklahoma boy. So grew up with J.J. Cale,
Yep.
right, who wrote those hits for Clapton, After Midnight and Cocaine.
Yep.
Right, the Okies. But then Leon went to L.A. Do you know what he did in L.A.? He was part of the Wrecking Crew.
Okay, yeah, I did know that, yeah.
Yeah, so he played on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds.
Yeah.
Right? Jan and Dean, the Wrecking Crew, I mean, it's worth a Google. I'm sure many of your listeners know it.
Probably everybody does, yeah.
Yeah. But Leon was part of that.
Yeah.
And so he's doing sessions with Sinatra, this type of thing. And then he kind of busted out on his own. And what people don't realize is that in the 70s, for 1 or 2 years, he was the highest grossing touring artist in the world.
I didn't know that.
He put on a rock and roll revival show like nobody's business.
Right.
Had a grand piano that he spent a lot of time up on top of, playing on.
As one does,
yeah.
Sure.
But his other accomplishments is he was the music director and the brains behind Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen.
Yep.
Also another top live album.
Absolutely.
Live album.
Yes.
So he brought that band together. And in fact, when Eric Clapton, because of the band, quit Cream and came through the Mid-South to make his first record, Leon was there. And Leon was part of that world with Delaney and Bonnie. And
that Delaney and Bonnie on tour with Eric Clapton, my dad's favorite album.
Oh, yeah.
And I have his copy that he bought the day it came out in 70 whatever. That was, for whatever reason, that was his most prized record, and I still have it, and I love it too. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, it is phenomenal. And is Leon playing on that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
He could be.
He probably is.
Well, if it's not him, it's Bobby Whitlock.
Right.
Right. But other known facts, Leon was a master songwriter. Do you know the hit for the Carpenters? Don't you remember you told me you loved
Yeah,
me, baby?
he wrote that.
Yep.
I did not know that.
Superstar
Okay.
for the Carpenters, Leon Russell.
I didn't know that. Huh.
Our life is a masquerade. By George Benson,
Mm-hmm.
Leon Russell.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, just amazing all-around guy. I think there was a documentary that came out before he died, produced by Elton John, right? He was Elton John's hero. Well, he's
Yes.
so many people's heroes.
Right.
So when George Harrison did his concert at Bangladesh,
Yeah.
right, Leon was, again, probably the music director there.
Yep.
And so that's him playing bass behind Bob Dylan and George Harrison doing Dylan's songs, right?
Nice.
Yeah, he was, his name was the Master of Space and Time.
Mm-hmm.
So many great albums, but this one is a very near and dear to me because he plays all these country songs true to form.
Interesting.
Yeah. Country, so then we have the most non-country guy that had one of the biggest effects on country,
Great album.
Graham Parsons. Yeah.
I don't own that, but I've been on the lookout for it for a while.
Well, Graham Parsons was was kind of a country rebel.
Yes.
In the day. He was what do you call those kids that have, he's a trust fund kid. His family was in orange juice.
I knew he was wealthy. I just didn't know what from.
In Georgia, yes.
Okay.
And his father died when he was young, very tragic and traumatic. His mother remarried and he never got along with his stepfather. But
I can relate to that.
yeah, but he was a trust fund kid. And he said, I want to be a country singer and a country star. So he has a lot of detractors, but at his heart, the guy accomplished so much before he died at a very young age, I think at age 27,
27, yeah.
in Joshua Tree with
Yeah.
an overdose of
In a hotel room, yeah.
heroin, yes.
Yeah.
But what he did is he put together not only the Flying Burrito Brothers,
Mm-hmm.
which were very influential in the whole country rock movement.
Yep.
They took these country themes and these, the nudie suits, the country clothes,
Oh, yes.
all of that, and they added rock elements, and I don't think there'd be an Americana movement without them.
There wouldn't be.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
So not only Burrito Brothers, but then he on these records he brought in, pretty much the Linda Ronstadt and his romantic interest at the time, his girlfriend, Emmylou Harris.
Yep.
Right? So this is where where her career really took off. And he was also, his touring band, excuse me, was to become Emmylou's hot band after Graham died, which were was Elvis's original band,
Yes.
including James Burton,
Yep.
the inventor
Master of the telecast.
the inventor of the chicken pick and the
Yep.
taka.
Yep.
Who played with, got a start on television with Ricky Nelson.
Yep.
And then went on to Elvis, and then Graham, and then Emmylou, and influenced generations of telecasters.
Absolutely.
But Graham kind of brought all that together
Yes.
in just a glorious way.
Yep.
So we're grateful for that.
Absolutely.
And he also had a very big influence on Sweethearts of the Rodeo by the Byrds. And in fact, this record wouldn't exist without him. He
Agreed.
sings all over it.
Yep.
The Byrds got their hit, I think in 1965 with a cover of Dylan's.
Yep.
So it's all one big circle, yes. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man.
Yep.
Right, and then they went from there and influenced the Beatles, or Beatles influenced them, and they were part of that thing. Of course, from the Byrds came, Chris Hillman, who had careers over 30, 40 years, but David Crosby for Crosby,
of
Stills,
course.
Nash. And one of the big influences from the Byrds was Roger McGuinn, who used to be Jim Gwynn McGuinn in the early
Certainly
60s.
back to the start of our conversation.
Yep.
Yep.
Playing on these folk things.
Yep.
out of Chicago, the Old Town School of Folk Music and
Sure.
the clubs there. And then he would play a 12-string, and he was the guy that really brought electric 12-string to the forefront in this type of music. But they changed so many times, the personnel and everything.
Oh, yeah.
But they coalesced around this and put out this record with just amazing country music, with most of the vocals by Graham Parsons on this record, and the inimitable Clarence White on guitar.
Yep.
Who took the Telecaster to whole new levels. So a very influential record in my.
I love it too. I don't own it, surprisingly, but I've heard it 1,000 times. Great record.
Yeah, it's not for sale.
That's all right. I can find one.
I'm sure you can. So to all the listeners out there. So we're rounding the corner. We're coming down to the final stretch. Just a couple more records left. This one is going to surprise your listeners.
Surprised me too.
Yeah. Look at that. Rod Stewart. Every picture tells a story.
It's a little bit of a departure from everything else.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Well, yes, because if you think of Ron Stewart, you think of tight satin pants and Don't You Think I'm Sexy, right?
That's what I think. Yeah.
Yes. Well, who wouldn't?
Right. I don't think he's sexy, but
Or you think of his later career doing the Great American Songbook,
Right.
What a lot of people don't. Well, and you have pretty sophisticated listeners, I would imagine.
Yes.
That they would be aware of the band Small Faces and the Faces.
Of course.
Right, and this is basically where Rod came from. When he partnered up with the Small Faces, they became the Faces as he became the lead singer for that band. And I would posit that without the Small Faces and the Faces, there would be no punk rock.
Right.
There would be no pub rock, right? Certainly in England.
Sure.
All the Ian Drury and the Stiff Records and all of that.
Right.
The birthed punk and Elvis Costello, that the Small Faces had big hits. Itchy Coo Park, right?
Yep.
In their day, and they were very complex. I mean, almost Beatlesque.
Yeah.
In arrangement and instrumentation, and very influential. So, and then the people that came through that, like just out of the Faces came Ronnie Wood.
Yep.
Guitarist for the Stones for the last 40 years.
Yep.
Still the new guy.
Yep.
Right?
Still the new guy.
Came the Who's second drummer, Kenny Jones.
Yes.
Yes, was from Small Faces and Faces.
Right.
Ian McLagan, the keyboard player from Faces and Small Faces. And he went on to do sessions with everybody. Played with the Stones for a couple years, played with Bonnie Raitt's band, Lucinda Williams.
Yep.
Like, he had an incredible career as a sideman. And I want to come back to that in a minute. But this record, it's really, there's a lot of Americana on here. He's got a song called Mandolin Wind. It's acoustic guitars and 12 strings and mandolins, right?
Not what I would think when I think Rod Stewart.
Yeah, no, this is very earthy stuff.
Okay.
Reason to Believe, the Tim Hardin song, the stunning example of songmanship by Tim Hardin. Excuse me. And also the big hit here, which was Maggie May, right? Which, I have to admit, it was a coming of age song for me. When I turned 13, this song was the thing that said, hey, there's a big world out there.
Right.
There's a big world for me out there. And I lived in a small farm town in the middle of nowhere. But yet Maggie May said, you know what? There's a big world for you. So this is a very near and dear to my heart.
Nice.
And it has nothing to do with pomp and circumstance of Rod's later years.
Right.
I think the musicianship and the songwriting on this is just stunning. Often overlooked record.
I have to admit, I haven't heard it. So
One of the keys for me is I have a dear and abiding fondness for Ian McLagan, the keyboard player, the guy who did the Hammond organ on Maggie May.
right.
Years ago, after I'd left Wilco, I toured for maybe 6 months with Billy Bragg.
Yep.
And Ian McLagan was in the band.
Oh, okay.
So Ian and I were the only beer drinkers on that tour, and we both loved Guinness. So we spent every night together after the show, knocking back Guinnesses and trading stories, mainly me listening to his incredible stories from his life.
Right.
And he played with Dylan as well for
Right.
a time. And he was married to Keith Moon's ex-wife.
Oh, okay.
Keith Moon's wife was a dancer on Ready, Steady, Go
Right.
as a teenager, and he married her, and it didn't work out. And it's an infamous story that when she left Keith, she hooked up with Ian, and that Keith put out a contract to have somebody break Ian's fingers.
Really?
And the story is that Pete Townsend found the guy who was to put out the contract and paid off the contract and said, "Don't break his fingers."
Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, and Ian would tell me the stories. Both he and his wife are sadly dead now.
Right.
But he told me the stories of, the late night phone calls from Keith to his wife, Kim, his ex-wife,
Wow.
that he would, be listening in on because he's just right there.
Right.
And how sad the end of Keith's life really was, succumbing to the
Sure.
drink.
Yeah.
Wow. So I felt so honored to get to play with Ian McLagan for those 6 months.
Nice.
Yeah, and we did an Austin City Limits show with Billy Bragg, and it's the first time I met Kim because they lived in Austin, and she came up to me every bit the model and dancer of Ready, Steady, Go from 40 years prior, and she said, "I just want to thank you so much for drinking Guinness with Ian.
Oh,
He thought he'd be lonely on this tour, and I want to thank you." Right?
that's nice.
And I was like, "Well, I can die now." Right?
I'll have to look up that Austin City Limits. I didn't know you did one with him.
Yeah, I've done one with him.
I know you did the one with Blue Rodeo,
And one with Blue Rodeo, yeah.
which I've seen.
Yeah.
Huh.
So this takes me back to my youth, to being 13 with Maggie May, and then there's Ian on the Hammond organ, and I got to experience that for 6 months of touring, and so
That'd be something.
yeah, so kind of an emotional pick. But
yeah.
for you listeners out there, give it a second listen, and I think you might be surprised by the Americanness of all of it.
Nice.
And then for the final one, Rob, it's, I think, probably the greatest rock and roll record ever.
Okay.
And people can disagree with me here.
I'm going to be one of them.
But I don't care. And that is, of course, Exile on Main Street. You can tell, very worn.
It's loved.
Yes, a very threadbare copy. But to me, this record, the Stones were, the reason I loved the Stones after the Beatles as a youth, as an adolescent, were the fact that they, right out of the gate, all of the interviews in the 60s and early 70s that I read, they said, "Yeah, we're something, but you really got to listen to Robert Johnson. You got to listen to, Sonny Boy Williamson. And you got to listen to Muddy Waters." They did not hide the fact that they were a pale imitation of American black blues band.
Yep.
And they said, "Yeah, you might like us, but go listen and support these people."
Right.
And there's a train of thought that there would be no 60s and 70s emergence and resurgence of interest in the blues before these people died if it wasn't for the British invasion.
Right.
They came over and said, "Here's one of your greatest assets, America. Wake the hell up."
Right, exactly.
So for that, ever grateful. I think the Stones are a bit like Dylan in that they've put out a lot of subpar material. I mean, if you look at their hits, I mean, it's undeniable.
Of course.
Over the years,
Yeah.
the hits, right?
Right.
And right out of the gate, you know, Jumping Jack Flash, perhaps one of the greatest rock songs of all time.
Yep.
So influential. So everyone knows the story of this record.
Everybody.
They were tax exiles. They go to the south of France and do a lot of blow and heroin, and in this shitty little damp basement, create this, what I consider a masterpiece. And one of the reasons I think it's a masterpiece is because almost by track, as a musicologist could go back and say, here's their nod to Sleepy John Estes.
Right.
Here's their nod to Robert Johnson.
Right.
That they really, I think their roots really shine through on this like they don't on other records.
Right.
And the guitar tones, I think, are stunning here.
Mm-hmm.
And how that happened, you know, I would love to have one of your listeners call in and tell me, but from all the pictures I've seen, the gear they used was their road gear, which was Ampeg.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And how they got those variations in tones between all of these songs with the same freaking Ampeg amp.
Yeah.
They didn't have a dozen little Fenders and little Gibsons and super amps, you know, that they could pull out to get these tones. It was plug into the amp.
The amp.
And yet they got, I think that is just stunning about this.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the things that I loved is that they said, you know, there would be no Keith Richards without Chuck Berry.
Of course.
Right. And they go right back and say Chuck's the guy.
Yep.
Right. And you go back and look at Chuck. I mean, he had a pretty interesting life,
I would say.
And with many, I mean, he was, you know, he's a felon.
Yep.
He was arrested for some very criminal behavior.
Of course.
Rightfully so.
Yep.
But the template he laid down and the lyrics that he laid down in the late 50s and early 60s were one of the broke down those barriers between black artists and white fans.
Yeah.
You know, as an American, that looms very, very large for us.
Sure.
The racial barriers and lines, they exist today.
Of course.
But back then, he was one of those artists that really, really broke through. And for that alone, for the social impact, I hold him in high regard alone, not for his personal behavior.
Right.
But then the fact that he influenced the Stones so much is another part of the attraction for me.
Sure.
And those are my top
12, that was fascinating, Bob. Thank
22
you.
records.
Thank you. I share a lot of those records. A lot of those are influential for me as well. We didn't pre-plan that list, but half of those I own and half of those I love. So it was just nice to hear someone else's perspective on it and someone who's a musician who's done this for their life. So I thank you for coming on and talking about records with me.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity to go back through my records and relive my past and spout about some of my experiences and my love for vinyl.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.
All right, everybody. That concludes my discussion with Bob about the records that are important to him. I hope you enjoyed that. I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. Please let me know. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments, and I'll see if Bob will answer them for us. Anyway, thank you for watching. Catch you on the flip side.